Hi, I'm Michael. It's been 6 years since I've used Drupal. Only got a chuckle out of that? Honestly? All right. My name is Mikel King. I am the Director of WordPress Development for Reader's Digest. And we use a lot of WordPress in our installation. One of the things I brought into the organization is the use of MU plugins. How many know exactly what an MU plugin is? 2, 3, 4. Okay. MU plugins. MU stands for must use. And I'm going to get into a little bit of detail about that in a moment. I just want everybody to understand. MU plugins require manual installation. There's no automatic download. You can't go to the plugin navigator, select a plugin, and install it as an MU plugin. It just doesn't work. You have to manually either, unfortunately, use FTP, which I definitely don't recommend, use SFTP, which is a secure file transfer protocol, or something along those lines, or a deployment system using SVN or Git and deploy it out to the code, which is a really good best practice. The reason you can't just install them through this is the MU-plugins directory doesn't even exist in WordPress. You have to manually create it. So the first time you do this, you have to create the plugin directory, set up the appropriate permissions, etc. There's all the documentation for that is on WordPress.org. MU plugins activate automatically. The moment you install them, as soon as you go to the page, those plugins are active. You cannot turn them off. So MU plugins are special by design.
So what directory do they live in?
They live in MU-plugins, but you have to manually create that to put them there.
Where would you create it? Within the plugin?
In the WP content. At the root level of WP content, parallel to plugins. Same thing with themes, and anyway. They're always persistent. Just like they can't be turned off, whatever code exists in an MU plugin is always there. And that's where this talk stems from. And then I have some other notes here. They do not generally work in a subdirectory structure. So a normal plugin gets installed in the plugins, and it has a directory, and then there's a plugin file or a matching .php to the name of the directory, and that's how the plugin exists in the plugin world. An MU plugin is generally a flat PHP file, a single PHP file. There's no directory structure within the MU plugins. And one of the rules of thumbs with an MU plugin is that you should not modify or alter the database schema. Because the plugins automatically activate, changing the database schema could have adverse effects to your WordPress installation. White screen of death, or worse, loss of data. So unless you really know what you're doing, it's not recommended. Now, the reason I have these red stars up here is to explain that there are plugins available that help you manage the MU plugins directory. Your mileage will vary with them. I honestly don't use them. It doesn't work with our particular system, especially since we use Git-based and deployment system. It wouldn't serve us any purpose to have a plugin to manage installing other plugins. And obviously with the database schema, as I said before, it's a use at your own risk. Any questions so far about?
You say this is a use at your own risk?
The database schema right here, double stars. Doo-doo. Yeah, that's, yes?
How much of an issue are there conflicts within these new plugins and perhaps other plugins that you load traditionally?
An MU plugin exists just like any other plugin, so there's always going to be a chance of or potential of namespace issues. And when we look at a little bit of code later, what I've tried to do is give an example, a very basic example, because I don't know everybody's skill set. So I've tried to find something I hope everybody can relate to from the code perspective so that I don't scare anyone. If you name your plugin the same as another person's plugin, just like anything else on .org, you're going to have a clash. There are ways around it, and hopefully what I'm going to demonstrate is a better practice or a good way of going about it. So the goals I have are to familiarize you with MU plugins, expose you to this new tool, which isn't really new. It's existed since, WordPress 3, but it was part of the multi-site system and you kind of had to unlock it. But then it was, multi-site was incorporated around WordPress 3.0 into the base. And
so MU originally was multi-user?
As
opposed to must-use?
Kind of. But they just decided to keep the name because it was already built in the system and then change it to must-use. So all intents and purposes, since we are on WordPress 4.1 to 4.2, just think must-use because you can't turn them off. And hopefully expand your horizons. Give you some ideas from development perspective of what you can do. And we'll go from there. Okay, why use MU plugins? I'm sure many of you are wondering, if you've got to install them manually and create all this stuff, why even go to all this effort? They grant you abilities that other systems of modification like drop-ins, theme modifications, and general plugins don't offer. Because they're always on. There are certain things that you can do with an MU plugin, and that's basically what I'm going to show you with this. The persistence model can be used to your advantage. If you have an API in your business that you need to talk to, say it's an internal API, to communicate to your ordering system because it's proprietary and you've built a plugin for that, any editor could go in and accidentally turn off your ordering system. But if you bundle that API in an MU plugin that nobody has access to, unless you manually go in through the command line to turn off, now your API is shall we say, editor-proof. So that's a good example of why you would want to use something like this. Because obviously you don't want to inhibit your users, your end users from, you can't hear? Oh. You don't want to inhibit your end users from being able to purchase whatever products you're selling, be it books, CDs, or whatever. So let's look at an example. This is actually from a site, not on Reader's Digest. This is one of my personal sites. I come from the BSD side of Unix. And as you can see, we have some table data here, and it doesn't look very pretty. I run the news magazine theme on this site. And it turns out this theme, the theme developer never thought of adding anything in to style a table. I found that to be kind of annoying. So originally, when I first started with WordPress, I hacked the theme and added the style in myself. Looks nice now. The problem is, he updated the plugin. I clicked update 2 years later, not even 2 years later, a year later, forgot that I had made those changes, and I was back to this. And I couldn't remember what it was I did. Luckily, I had some version control. I was able to go back through, find what I had modified. And I said to myself, there's got to be a better way than just adding my code to the style CSS of somebody else's theme. This is not a good way. And if you're running a business, obviously this is a personal site, so if you're running a business, this is not something you want to do. And you don't want something as simple as, especially with WordPress having automatic updates now. If you have automatic updates turned on, then this sort of thing would have happened in your end users. Yes?
What about child themes? Child themes?
Yes, child theme would be a way to go. The reason again, I'm trying to show an example of how to use an MU plugin. But yes, a child theme is a possibility. So, let's look at, this is just a side-by-side comparison. Definitely, the one on the right here looks a lot better. Everybody agree? It's much more readable and has nice headers and everything. So, the code, or some of the code for this, exists on my GitHub. And this goes back to your question about namespacing. One of the things about MU plugins is WordPress automatically lists all the PHP files in the MU plugins directory and loads them in alphabetical order. If you have a plugin that requires other libraries of code to exist, you have to figure out how to make it load first. So this is the trick I came up with. This singleton base is actually used by this file. So I had to mess with the file system to make them load in a particular order. And because I want to be able to build other plugins off of this, I had to make sure that they load before everything else. So they get loaded very early in the WordPress process. Okay. So hopefully I'm not going to scare too many people by looking at some code. Down on the lower part of the screen, this is the file hierarchy that I use inside the actual plugin that is based on those other two files. This is the single PHP file, all of the code in that PHP file. And what I want to go through and show you is this base plugin exists in here. That is an MU plugin. So I didn't have to check and see if base plugin class exists. I didn't have to do an if class exists catch. Because it's an MU plugin, that code is automatically created and live. I don't have anything that's turned on in that plugin. The code is just available for me to use as many times as I want, reuse over and over and over again. So every plugin that I build on our sites, whether it's for an ad pixel, audience tracking, putting up CSS, or doing some silly little JavaScript stuff, I use the base plugin and I extend it and I add the bits and pieces that I need. Does that clear to everybody so far? Who wants to take a little deeper walk through this code? Okay. So we're going to go to the next page. This is the CSS file. It's very basic. Everybody pretty much knows CSS. That's this file right here. And this just grabs the URL, does the standard register styles and queuing. How many people register and enqueue their CSS or their JavaScript? Raise your hands. How many know you should register always your CSS? Okay, so let's go through that because that's a very important thing and that's part of what I wanted to show. It's also part of the reason why I didn't do a child theme because, and you can do it with a child theme, it gets a little bit trickier. You can add this to the functions and work that way around it, but again, I wanted to show a plugin. So the biggest reason why you want, and you'll notice that this self version is up here. And what happens is that gets appended to the call to the CSS when it's embedded into WordPress. So every time I modify this plugin and I update it, especially if I'm updating the CSS file, if I bump the version, it tells the browser that there's a new version of that CSS file, download it. Otherwise, the browser caches it. Now my personal servers and RDs, rd.com, Reader's Digest servers, we cache browser objects like that for 480 days. That's a long time to just be sitting there. If we didn't use the built-in methods that WordPress gives us for version bumping and cluing the browser in, then the site would always look out of date. The reason we do this is so the browser never downloads the same file twice. It makes the page load faster. So you do that with your JavaScript, you do that with your CSS. Okay. Let's go through. All right. I'm going to attempt to actually go to code. I'm sorry that this is small, but unfortunately it's very tight. So this file, and I'm going to, yes, that's at the top. Okay. Can everybody read this? I don't know if I can, but I'm going to try. Is that better? Yeah, okay. All right. So this class is an abstract class. This is the base of the entire system. It is also an MU plugin. It is the first MU plugin that gets loaded in our system. It's called Singleton Base. Most of the plugins I deal with are based on a PHP Singleton class, and they're actually based on this class. All of my plugins are based on this class. The reason being is because this class provides certain things, namely these two, call static and call. If you create a plugin and you forget to ship out all the pieces to the plugin, and you create a method in the plugin but you forget to define that method, because they're based on this class, they capture it, and rather than getting a white screen of death, I get an error entry in the log file so that I can catch it. So I fail gracefully. That's why I went to the trouble of developing this. The other thing that I did with this, because the constructor is protective, you can't new this class. You can't create a new instantiation of this class. You can only do it within itself. And I'll get down to that here. With the get instance. So the only way I can get a new copy of this is from get instance. Now we'll go back. This is base plugin, which you saw in the previous code. It extends the singleton base. The reason I do a double extension like this is because this code bit has things that are WordPress specific. The singleton base is just a standard PHP singleton class. And the reason I do that is because that's licensed under a BSD license. There's nothing in it that relates to WordPress. I just happen to use it in WordPress. Whereas this is actually GPL. And there's nothing saying that you can't modify the BSD one. It's just because I use it in the BSD world as well. I need to make sure that it's compatible both ways. And because BSD is compatible with GPL, there's no issue there. How many people know that WordPress contains BSD license code directly in it? I see one person in the back. All the RSS feed stuff that's built into WordPress is based on SimplePy, which is a BSD project. Anyway, that's enough about licensing. Hopefully I'm not scaring again too many people with the code. There's not a lot to go through this. This just provides basic WordPress functions. The things that it does for me is if a plugin has activation, if I make a plugin based on these that needs to modify the schema, it's done in the regular plugins where you activate it manually, etc. You want to have your activation actions, your deactivation, and your uninstall, so you clean up after yourself. That's just good practice. It's being a good housekeeper with WordPress. So I built this extension to automatically offer that. You can't instantiate those here, but in the base plugin, which we're going to go back to right now, we can add those and self-reference them. So I can create a list of actions that I want to have happen, and the plugin will take care of it automatically for me. All I have to do is call the init in the constructor. Is everybody familiar with object-oriented coding and practices? Okay. Some of this is going to go over your heads. And there's not really a lot of ways that I can get around that, but hopefully I can try and explain it in a way that makes it explainable. The meat and the potatoes of what's happening here is this call right here in the plugin. You don't need to worry about any of the extensions. You just need to know to create a plugin, you extend the base. Because the base and the singleton base exist in an MU plugin, I can create any plugin from that that I need. And then I just add my actions to the constructor. The one piece that's missing from here is the piece that shows you how to actually turn it on.
Are your plugins that you add, is that comparable to a functions.php page where you just have a running
The
list?
problem, well, let's get into that actually. Let's go beyond this because I want to talk about functions.php. Because you're getting to this. So what's the point? As we said before, I can modify the style sheet. I could create a child theme, but it's not the most effective way to do this. And also it didn't help with the demonstration to create a child theme. Could do an add import, but the same problem is you would have to go into the style sheet, add the add import. And then we could just add whatever enqueuing functions we need to the functions.php. The problem is the functions.php becomes a dumping ground for code. Many sites I've worked on have over 2,000 lines of code in functions.php. It's a nightmare to troubleshoot. And how do you turn off just one element of that code? You have to walk through the entire file, find that function you want to turn off, comment it out, and hope that you got all the pieces right. This is again why I prefer to put everything in a plugin. There are certain things that just belong in plugins, and there are certain things that belong in the theme. And code that manipulates database tables or things like that doesn't belong in your theme, honestly. How many people are having trouble connecting all the dots on this? 2? Okay, that's not so bad. Okay. I think these points are pretty self-explanatory. Every time you update the theme, you're responsible for re-implementing the changes you made to that theme to keep it consistent with what your style is. If you want to switch themes, but you still want to keep, in this case, the CSS for the table prettiness that I have, you'd have to migrate that to that theme. Because it's in a plugin, based on an MU plugin, those aren't going anywhere. I can either turn it off if the new theme has a nice table schema, or I can turn the plugin on and change themes without issue. I don't have to worry about copying the code. Obviously, it's only a few lines of code, but still, the demonstration here is to show how you would actually enqueue. And I'm going to go back to it so that hopefully we can take some questions and give you some answers. And the bottom thing is just to remember that this is a high-level example, but it's also a real-world example. I actually have a site running with this because I got tired of every time the author updated the theme and he didn't accept the changes that I suggested of, hey, why don't you just put these 3 lines of code or whatever in for the table? He didn't want to add them in. All right, whatever. I have a plugin.
Doesn't that child theme protect you from that?
The child theme kind of does, yes. But again, I like being able to turn it off with the button at the plugin level if I want to change themes, which I might in the near future. There are a number of news themes out there for this particular site that it's a good thing. Okay, I'm going to go back to the code and hopefully be able to answer some questions. Anybody have a question? Yes?
I noticed that you set up activator and deactivator functions.
Right. They're actually, yeah.
Using like the magic method style, but they're not a magic
Yeah,
method.
that's something that I've been experimenting with it. It's actually because I was going to make them private methods, and then I haven't changed the code to go around that to make them just protected.
Don't you still have to worry then about potentially PHP upgrading and turning those into magic methods in the future?
If they're private methods, then I don't have to worry about it, but I was going to change them to protected methods and then lose the underscores anyway. It was just a model that with private methods, you're supposed to put a underscore. It's a recommended practice to put a single underscore before a private method so that it just stands out. There are so many different, and that's the pair standard. It's not even the fig standard. So it's like, depending on which standard that you follow, you know, in my particular company, we use a combination of many different standards, whether it's fig, Etsy, and pair. They all are similar, but they all have differences, and we kind of had to pick the best ones. And that's one of the ones that we're probably going to jettison because it's just, somebody had a question over here.
You said that WordPress loads the plugins alphabetically, the bounding?
Alphanumerically, yes. So what I did to cheat the system, and I actually learned this from BSD, in the RC directory, they actually load a lot of daily scripts, and they prefix everything with 000 and then 010, etc., so that you can control the order of which things load and fire in their system. And it turned out that WordPress does the same thing. So by doing this, I ensure that this is always loaded before everything else, and then I've given myself a gap of 10 in case I needed to put something else in between the base plugin for the WordPress side of things. I probably won't, but it's all on my GitHub, and as I update the code, and as the gentleman asked over there before, you can fork it if you want to. Yep, it's BSD and GPL license. This file is BSD license. This file will be GPL license. So you can do whatever you need to do with it, build plugins off of it, etc.
I know some people asked about this and functions.php.
Right.
So actually, I had an example that I actually did for someone that wouldn't change depending upon the theme, right? Style their login page.
Yep.
I mean, the login logo, they wanted some terms and conditions before someone registered on their site, and it didn't matter what theme they had, that was always going to be there. So using Michael's technique, it's there. It's
Right.
never going to change, no one's never going to touch
The
it.
login page for rd.com is based on this, exactly the same thing. Because it's not plugin specific. I mean, it's not theme specific. The same thing with all the ridiculous, I'm not a big fan of ads, but we have a lot of ads in RD. All the ad pixels that they keep throwing at us to put in for the GPT. I have a plugin that manages, it's based on this, that manages all those ad pixels and puts them on the proper pages where they're supposed to be. And it's just a bunch of JavaScript getting enqueued and registered like it's supposed to. Yes.
So would it be safe to put, let's say you're on a website that uses a lot of custom post types, would it be safe to use
Exactly.
custom post types in a plugin as opposed
Custom
to
post type is a perfect example of why you'd want to use an MU plugin. Because if you have a custom post type, let's say you're a small mom and pop shop and you sell records. You have a custom post type for the records that has the artist and the I can't even think of what the barcode, the UPC code for the, so you can search it and the product code and all that other stuff that builds your custom post type. If you put that in a regular plugin, anybody can turn it off. If it's in an MU plugin, at least you know your custom post type is always there, and then obviously you're gonna have to do work on your theme to render it properly, but you can probably get away with some plugins to do filtering, et cetera, et cetera. But all the other stuff that rely on that custom post type to be there when they need it, if it's in an MU plugin, it's always there. Yeah. You had a question?
So I'm kind of a newbie. I barely follow what you're saying here, but would it be helpful? Can you tell us what MU plugins you're running at Reader's Digest or at Catalog? You know, so what?
Again, we have API plugins that talk to internal systems that we don't want turned off because we need to talk to all those systems. We have other utilities that I've built just to make managing the site a little easier, like debugging plugins. We've added, again, based on all this, we have a class that adds a query string without using WP query because we don't want to pollute the rewrite rules, but we still use the query string, and we have a custom query string that we add so that we can go to any page, add this custom query variable and a parameter to it to, again, dump the rewrite rules onto the screen so we can see what's happening on the production site, or to look at the WP post type. So we have a debug class that is available to us, and because it's always active, all we had to do go in the theme and add the hook in where we needed it so that that particular page, if we're trying to troubleshoot a page, because sometimes you have a development and a staging environment, and as much as you try and keep your staging environment exactly like your production, there's always a deviation. Being able to troubleshoot things on the fly in production is huge. And part of that debug plugin, one of the things it does is it can actually dump the contents to the screen. There's an alternative method, shall I say, that'll actually hide the content that we want to see, that dump, in between HTML comments so the end user doesn't see it, but we see it. The other thing that's built into it is we have a plugin, another MU plugin that's, think of it like a firewall. If you're not on the right IP blocks, you can't use that debug plugin either. So that's built into another plugin, so it's sort of like a blacklisting, whitelisting thing. And then you have to have the right URL string, and you have to be on the right IP blocks, so all these things come together, and that's why they're encapsulated in different places using OO. Let's see if I have code here. Nope. Pardon me. Since I didn't do, unfortunately, I didn't have time to do a JavaScript. I wanted to show in queuing that. Because there's one piece of information with JavaScript and queuing that you have that you don't get with style sheets. You have a choice of enqueuing JavaScript in the header or the footer. And this would be an example where if we look at the base plugin that we've inherited this guy from, because it's extending base, everything that exists in this file, including these two constants, in header and in footer, exists in the child class. And the reason for that is when you're registering your JavaScript, and obviously I don't have an example that's really good, but the next parameter after this in WP register script would be true or false. That's the value that they want you to put there. The problem is 6 months from now when you're troubleshooting things and trying to read through your code, trying to remember what the true and what the false was, which one is going to put you in the header and which was not. That's why we use named properties, by using those constants. That's why we use named properties up here. How many people do coding and do unit testing? How many people have heard of unit testing? Okay, good. That's another reason why we use named properties, because they're instantly unit testable. because those values are not allowed to change ever. So by having these sorts of things baked into the system, like the in footer and the in header, it makes the code that much easier to maintain. I have several developers who are offshore in India. English is not their first language. By going to these constructs, I've been able to increase their development output because now things are clear and we're all coding from the same page. And it makes it a lot easier. Obviously, you look at something like this where we're registering the style, and at first many people are probably saying, what the hell is self-tabular style slug? It tells you what it is, but what the hell does that mean? Fortunately, you can look up here and you say, okay, that's the slug. And if we looked at the actual HTML output of the page, you would actually see tabular-data-CSS. WordPress always puts a -CSS after CSS files. And you can search for this when you look in the code source to make sure that that was actually enqueued on the page like it's supposed to. Obviously, you could also look at the output and say, hey, yeah, it looks right. But if it doesn't, if it still looks like this, you can always look at the source code and say, was it there? The other thing it needs is the URL relative to the WP content directory for a plugin. And that's what this get asset URL. It's just an abstraction of the plugin's URL, and the goal was to actually make this particular method plugin or theme universal. I just haven't quite riddled all that out, so right now it just does plugins. And that way it would automatically return the right relative URL always. Yes?
So you have the tabular CSS folder, is that in your plugins folder?
No, this is actually the tabular CSS plugin that's based and derives from the MU plugins. So what I'm trying to show you here is because base plugin and singleton base exist in the MU, they're available to the entirety of my WordPress installation. This right here is a separate plugin that I've written based on the MU plugin.
So is the plugin dynamically generated?
No, I actually wrote this code, but this is all the code I need for this particular plugin to be in place. I have two files. I have a plugin PHP and then the CSS file. If I had JavaScript or images that were part of this plugin, they would be, what I'm trying to do is show the standardized hierarchy that I've put together for this. Yes?
If you set up your content, your content folder outside of your WordPress installation,
right,
would it work the same?
Yes, because you have to go into your WP config, and there's a defined variable that you have to set telling WordPress where that WP content is. You can change WP content to whatever you want. In fact, right, I'm trying to remember, there's a hosting provider that changed the name of WP content to app. For whatever reason, that's what they changed it to. And everything is relative to that app. But WordPress is looking for this URL asset relative to whatever you call WP content. Normally they look for WP content. You can do the same thing with the uploads folder. If you want to move that somewhere else, there's a lot of things you can do. You don't even want to see what my WP config looks like. I actually have a series of classes. Everything's abstracted because I have a development, a test, a staging, and a production environment. And I have 3 different production environments because of load balancing and which one you're hitting, and database balancing, and it just gets very confusing for most people, even on my team. So, I keep it all straight though. Does anybody have any questions about this? Yes?
I lost you on the last part. So you have 2 new plugins.
Yep.
And then this is just a regular.
This is just a regular plugin that in.
And so you were saying before that you have a problem where the other guy updated his name.
Right.
And,
because it was embedded in the style CSS.
Right. So what are you gaining here by?
This was just an example to show how you use an MU plugin.
Right.
So what I've done is I wrote a plugin that actually inherits from the MU plugins. These 2 classes, base and the singleton base, exist everywhere in WordPress because they're part of the MU plugins.
Right. So if you weren't extending base plugin here, what was the issue? Like, how does it get overwritten when he?
That was because it was in the style file. I actually went in and modified the style. And at one point I put it in as a separate file, but then I'd still go back into the modified style to import it in, and then another time I said, all right, I'll just put it in the functions.php, and then the functions.php gets replaced, and it's like, okay, we could go with child theme. I said, I don't want a child theme because I want to be able to have this possibly if I just change themes altogether. And that's why I decided, you know what, I'm going to write a plugin that just enqueues this thing properly. The other thing is that because I'm doing the versioning here, now my browser's caching that. So just by putting the code and importing it into the style theme, I wouldn't get that caching the same way. I wouldn't be able to tell the browser there's a new version of this file, whereas now I can.
But if you weren't extending base plugin here, and you just had the regular...
I could write all of the code that I was using for base plugin. I could do it all in this single PHP file. But the idea is that I'm trying to base all of my plugins off of a standardized installation of a library of code.
Right.
You know, and the same thing with the debug and or I have another plugin that's an MU plugin that I call Variation. It's a variance plugin. So I can do A/B testing, and that plugin, all I have to do is create a new variant and give it the name of the variant. And then it has static methods that I can check for that variant on another page. So I can do swapping with a URL parameter. So I can have users see, and since we only use that for editorial staff, internal changes, not end user A/B testing. And because it's part of the MU plugins, I don't have to worry about checking in the theme. If class variant exists, it's always there.
Wouldn't it be theme independent even if you weren't extending base plugin, or no?
With the variant system, it's not theme independent. Because I'm going in and I'm swapping out, say, the article page for a different variant because of the URL parameter, the way I'm doing it. There's a new system that's coming out with the theme switcher that you can do, but that's not quite right yet. So, and that's what I came up with a year ago, so that's what we've been using. And it also lets me change out just an element on the page easily enough. We do that a lot with, again, I hate ads, but when we get a new ad company, because the marketing director signed a contract before actually reading the fine print, I can actually show this is the before and after, and this is, you know, that new ad system you just agreed to put up is dragging our site down, and here's why. And I can show them the before and after performance and show them how bad of an idea it was. But anyway.
So can we identify what ME plugins your site's running? Can someone identify what ME plugins you might be running?
Yes, because when you go into the plugins page, if, and I don't have, let's see if I have code that I can show you. So I don't. Of course I don't. Come on, laptop, stop fighting with me. MU plugins should have, at the top of the file, a plugin definition block, just like any other plugin. And if they do, then when you go into the plugins page and you have MU plugins, it'll actually show must use and the number of must use plugins you have, and it'll identify them and list them with the versions.
No, I mean on the browser side.
On the browser side?
I'll inspect the inspector and see what you're running there or not?
No. No, it's all PHP.
Right, so I've never, because it's...
You wouldn't see it from an end user perspective. You would see it in the CMS.
Right.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
so if you don't know how to write PHP, this is really useless.
It's not so much as really useless. I'm hoping I'm giving you an idea, or because there are MU plugins that exist out there.
Yeah. Appreciate it.
But if you're not a PHP programmer, it's definitely going to be outside the realm of what most people are going to be doing. Yes.
So you would recommend for us to use your two files as our base for...
I'm offering them up for anybody to use. I'm not saying you have to use them. My team developing, they do, because again, we have language issues, and maintain that consistency. It has actually made things so much easier across the board.
Yeah.
So it's a question of what you like. If you don't like object-oriented programming, don't use them. If you do, and these give you a good guidance, go for it.
Right, and then just the second part of that question. Are there, if we go online, is there a library of other people's MU plugins, and then would they be compatible or incompatible with your two files?
I think they would be compatible with my two files because of the namespacing issue. And that's one of the other things that I'm working on for it. In the GitHub page, I have a standalone plugin that I've been working on based on those, so they can actually be incorporated in. Again, it's a PHP construct, adding a namespace, and it gets a whole much more complicated than what we have here. So that's something that's kind of in development and progress as we go along.
But are there resources out there?
There are a few. I just don't know of any off the top of my head. There are some plugins that are on the .org site that say that they can be turned into. They're generally single file plugins that even though they come in a directory, you can take it out of the directory, drop it in MU, and it's on. Both plugins that I've published, the Ajax Heartbeat tool and the simple iframe buster, were designed, unfortunately they were built long before I came up with this, but they were designed with the idea of being MU plugins. There are no settings, nothing that it does to WordPress that requires user intervention. And if it's something like you want to slow down the heartbeat or keep people from stealing your content, you just drop it in there, it's done. Especially if you're running a multi-site. MU plugins are absolutely great for MU's multi-site systems. I actually have a question over here first.
I was kind of interested in seeing the base plugin go a little more. We didn't spend too much time talking about what the build to that.
Well, actually, let's see. Which one I have open here? And I don't know. Is that big enough?
Make it bigger.
Make it bigger. Okay. All right. So, is that big enough? All right. So, we don't need to look at licensing information. That's boring. Blah blah blah. Anywhere you want to start with specifically?
Okay.
It's really, again, it's very basic. All it does is offer you these two properties.
Yes, the housekeeping.
Yeah. And the reason for that is, sorry, I'm touching the wrong spots. Again, I have these particular functions that are public, and they actually do the activation, deactivation. But if it's not self-activated, it's not going to run those activation actions. And the idea is originally that it was going to be an abstract class, but you can't have an abstract class extending an abstract class, so it gets all kind of muddy. But the idea is that any actions you want, you would add into your your child class into that method, and when you run init in your constructor, it would add those activation hooks and deactivation hooks and install in WordPress automatically for you. Again, the idea behind this came from taking people who knew PHP but didn't really follow proper WordPress activation hooks, registering JavaScript. I mean, a lot of times they would just code the JavaScript directly into the page. You don't get any enqueuing value, you don't get any versioning, you don't get any browser caching. You lose so much by doing things like that. So the idea was to give my team, again, who a lot of them, English is not their first language, a framework with which to work in that they could build from very easily and in a consistent manner. You have a question?
Yes. So I'm going through like learning WordPress.
Yep.
Which I know is going to take like forever. But anyway, if I wanted to find out about stuff like this, I mean, I'm taking notes right now so I can go back and look. But in order to know these kinds of things like enqueuing and what should I register, all
the codex. WordPress.org, the codex is the absolute be-all, end-all information.
Where specifically in there in terms of that kind of stuff?
The easiest thing I've always found is to just start typing WP register. I can't even see my screen.
I have no idea about enqueuing or anything like that, and honestly, like some of the stuff that I've used, like, you know, certain themes or plugins or whatever, I've never seen any of that in there. So
I'm sorry, the font is so small, I can't even see what I'm doing here. Of course it's not found because I typed with my left hand and I can't read what I'm doing, so. WP _register script. Hopefully that's right. It's not. Of course it's not.
Sorry.
I can't even read that.
WP register script?
That hopefully will come up with something, unless I'm not connected to the internet anymore, which is entirely possible. Yeah, I'm off the internet.
Yeah,
so
it keeps on
totally off the grid.
To, cable Wi-Fi.
Let's try this again and see if we connect. Hey, we got stuff. Okay. Documentation WordPress, first thing that comes up. basically the codex is your friend. I don't recommend reading the code itself if you're new to WordPress, but if you've been working with WordPress for a while, there's no reason you can't read the core of WordPress. Just don't modify the core, trust me. You don't want to do it. All right, I'm probably off the internet again, but hey, there we go. So this is the standard documentation, and it does give some examples about enqueuing and whether you're doing procedural versus object-oriented. Obviously, as you saw, I do everything object-oriented that I can. I just find it the reusability factor much better. You had a question as well. Do you remember what it was? That's okay. Okay. While you're coming up with that,
I remember. You said that in order to define and must-use plugins, all it has to be it has to have the plugin block and be a single file?
It has to be a single file. It has to exist in the mu-plugins directory, which you have to manually create the first time.
Okay. What is it?
mu-plugins, just like that. Okay. And it has to be underneath whatever your WordPress, your WP content directory is. It's parallel to plugins.
Parallel to plugins.
Yeah, it's parallel to plugins. So this is some contact information, and that's really all there is to it. All the slides are available already on SlideShare. So hopefully you guys found this useful and informative.
Are those links on your website?
That's Twitter, LinkedIn, GitHub. That's to the GitHub page.
Right, but not your website.
No.
So I'm looking at your website, I don't see links to this.
Which website are you looking at?
I think it's yours. Were you doing this postcard?
Yes, I was.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I didn't put this on michaelking.com
Okay.
because I just don't have time. And normally I wouldn't put this there anyway. I have another site that I put that kind of stuff on. If you go to jafdip.com, there's actually an article that I wrote maybe a year ago about building your own WordPress core that touches on some of this. And that was one of the precursors to this system that I've come up with. And it's continually evolving, that's why I put it on GitHub, so that people could fork it or contribute to it. Got it? Okay. Any questions? Any other questions? No? All right.
I have a question, but it's not plugin related.
You can talk afterwards if you want.